Hello, welcome back to part 2 of the Air Castle. Well, physical defense will not help too terribly much where I'm going, although, to be honest, I kind of forgot about that when I was walking in. I just wanted more means of attack now that I had a better idea of what I was going into on the top floors. This time our goal is to head underground in the Flying Castle. I don't know how to make that sound like it makes sense, but it's what we're doing. Now, that trip I took back to Dezolis was not technically necessary. When you go through the gate that was guarded by that boss barrier, there's a recovery panel. To my knowledge, you can't actually save the game on that one, and I was a little bit nervous to press forward without that, so here we are. Now, this room confused me in two different ways. In a practice run, I went that way, saw that the doorway was guarded, and I thought, oh no, I went around in a loop somehow, and so I have to figure out what way I was actually supposed to go, when in fact, yeah, I had been progressing the whole time, and I just needlessly walked backward a whole lot. There's a good reason I didn't record that. Also, against a group like this, it's not such a bad idea to run away, because there's a fairly high chance to succeed, and if you fail, you don't lose too much. Of course, not all encounters are like that. And of course, this time I thought that the way forward might have been something else, but at least this one wasn't too much of a disaster. And here we have an oddity which I knew nothing about when I first played the game because I hadn't played Phantasy Star 1, which is the basement of the Air Castle is modeled perfectly after the layout of the Air Castle in Phantasy Star 1 when it was a 3D maze. I believe that the original intention for Phantasy Star 4 was to include 3D mazes as well, but they decided against it. My sense on that is I would have been annoyed at the time I bought the game for the Genesis many years back, but today I would have found it to be pretty fun. Speaking of which, I have some interesting memories of playing Phantasy Star 1. It was the Game Boy Advance version, and I was playing in a situation where I had very little internet access. And that game does not have auto maps, so what I did have was graph paper and a pencil, so I used that. And I can't say I disliked it. To the best of my recollection, it was actually something I enjoyed once I figured out how to do it and make the map reasonably accurate, and how to navigate by it. You know, navigating by a map that you drew yourself is actually pretty satisfying. I know that it wouldn't work with today's games because people would just look up maps online, probably. Oh well. I'd still like to try out something along those lines later, although I probably wouldn't record it because drawing stuff by hand would be a little time consuming and doesn't convert to camera very well. Now from now on I'm going to show all of the encounters. Not because of the stuff you're watching right now, of course. You've seen this stuff already, and it's not too terribly intense, but wait till I go down another floor or two. Oh, another thing about Lashiec, the guy that you're... Oh, interruption. Chaos Sorcerer. This is not the same Chaos Sorcerer you fight as a mini-boss on the shuttle way back when. The Chaos Sorcerer has a wide variety of spells, and most of them are very, very troublesome to deal with. I lucked out there because the sorcerers are pretty fast and usually get it one turn in, but don't worry, you'll see plenty of their actions as we progress. I think these guys alone change the nature of the dungeon by a lot. The most important two things about them is they have a very high mental stat, and they have quite a few skills that attack the party as a whole. So that's going to put a lot of strain on resources. The reason I want to show all the encounters is to sort of put that in context and give a better idea of exactly what the player has to do to cope with it. Now, about Lashiec. I've already talked about what he did as a tyrannical king a little bit. What I didn't talk about was a little bit more of his origin story. This isn't really elaborated on in-game, as far as I could tell, but in some of the side explanation, he was apparently a pretty decent person. He may have even been a good and benevolent leader. But he was approached by a cult, and then, one way or another, he got influenced by Dark Force. Now, I lucked out greatly with this encounter, because there are two actions that the Chaos Sorcerer takes that are not actually a big deal, and what you saw was one of them. He doesn't do those two things very often. Speaking of things that don't happen very often, I don't use Eliminate nearly as much as I did in previous playthroughs. I think that's because, well, with other instant death attacks, an enemy can often have, for example, high physical durability but low magical, or vice versa, so you can target a weakness. There are not a whole lot of random encounter monsters with low agility. You'll notice that even after I've gained some levels, these guys often move before Rika does, which does not say good things about her chances of hitting Eliminate. I probably got better luck with it in previous runs because I did more grinding. Which is a bit of a shame because it's actually pretty stylish when you get it to connect. Going back to the topic of Dark Force in Phantasy Star 1, I think that lore-wise, it was at its most interesting in that game, or at least they handled the mystery better than later on, although it wasn't too bad in Phantasy Star 2. Yeah, that's the other problem with Chaos Sorcerers. If you get ambushed by a Chaos Sorcerer encounter, you are in a lot of trouble, especially, as you saw, it can have specters which also cast corrosion. That's why, in between battles, you cannot really afford to leave your party members with any kind of damage. even though Chaos Sorcerers are standard for encounters, I still have no hesitation to use crosscuts on them, because while there is a boss, and a very intimidating one at that, it's okay because I can use other things. Once again, one of the great things about the skill system in this game. I wish more games worked like this. So, why Dark Force was done well? There were only some very vague hints about its existence throughout the game. The most blatant one is when Alice encounters it as a nightmare, and in that sequence it is absolutely shrouded. You can only see its glowing eyes and a little bit of its face. Aside from that, there are very few clues about it. So at the very end, you discover a secret passage in I think it was the mayor of Parma's, or I don't think it was quite like that, but in an important mayor's mansion, and this mayor had been acting strange. So you go down there, and when you go down, there's a trapdoor into a dungeon with very difficult encounters that you should run away from with the escape rope if you know what's good for you. And at the end is a secret door, the only one in the entire game, which is why I had a lot of difficulty realizing there even was one, and that I thought there was a problem with my hand-drawn maps for the longest time. And when you walk through the door, you are just attacked, and this is where the mistranslation really hurts the effect, because it's supposed to say Dark Force, but the mistranslation says Dark Falz, F-A-L-Z. For reasons unknown to me, they kept that translation for Phantasy Star Online. It gives me a headache whenever I look at it. I do not understand. And the reason this makes me so angry is that, looking at the situation, this is a thing that you definitely don't know what it is. Dark Force is absolutely not its real name, if it even has one. It's just the best name you could come up for it at the time. It's a Dark Force and it's attacking you. Later on they formalize it a little bit. For example, earlier in this game, you saw Rune refer to it as Dark Force as though it's its proper name. Also in Phantasy Star 3, it speaks to you and calls itself Dark Force, which is one of the reasons I kind of side-eye the continuity of that game. Phantasy Star 2 handles it slightly differently. They say, oh, this is this thing that you call Dark Force. Which is okay, as far as I can tell. In the continuity of 1, 2, and 4, Dark Force never speaks. It is entirely alien, it's definitely malicious, and from its actions, it's also certainly intelligent. Its plans actually get stronger in each consecutive game, as it kind of figures out how things work. And one of the reasons you know it's intelligent early on is that it realizes what you, the characters, are doing and tries to, as I said, attack you in your sleep when you're at that mansion, actually. It's a place you visit early on, then leave for most of the game, and then return at the end. So that's a nice bit of continuity. Right. This was a mistake, by the way. I absolutely should not waste turns when dealing with this. I should be using crosscut every time until I run out. Or else that happens. I paid for that mistake. and rightfully so. This is some of that tough but fair stuff that I enjoy so much in these games. Nathu! That is a very important thing to learn before the boss of this castle. You saw how destructive Githu was against Dark Force. Nathu is, of course, stronger, but that alone is not going to be enough. I mean, it's not a spoiler to say that Lashiec is at the end of this dungeon, but the particulars are intense. And that's the reason I'm kind of conserving Rune's technique points. Because it is not a short boss fight that we're dealing with. And even though it would be very nice to hit Chaos Sorcerers with Nephoi every time I encounter them, I can't afford that because I'm going to encounter a lot of them. And unlike Crosscut, this will deplete from what Rune can do later. I gotta tell you though, it is so weird playing Phantasy Star Online 2 and having all those dark forces talk to you, call themselves dark... No, they're not even calling themselves Dark Force, they're calling themselves Dark Falses. I have trouble wrapping my mind around it. And if I had the skills, I would go in and see if I could do a better translation myself. Unfortunately, I have neither the skills nor the patience for that, and that's to my detriment because that means I have to deal with the official translation, which makes me a little bit angry. Well, okay, they probably would still call themselves Dark Forces because, after all, this is a different continuity we're dealing with. But I cannot get over Dark Fowls. It hurts. But enough complaining about that. Oh, dealing with these Chaos Sorcerers is also an occasion where it is a very good thing that I got that Plasma Launcher for Wherein in one of the side dungeons, because otherwise I'd probably have to have him use Flare against them, and he wouldn't have much, if any, ammo for the boss by the end. One of the nice things about the Demence Worm encounters is that I can more or less ignore them and just go for the Chaos Sorcerer. There's no need to even have, for example, to have Rune use Bra in the first turn of it. Because I'm pretty sure that's going to deal garbage damage to the Chaos Sorcerer. And of course, this is where they showed up in Phantasy Star 1. They were not quite as bad in that game, though. They didn't use party-wide attacks so much, no. One thing that I find interesting that was sort of phased out is... The first game had you just fighting straight up dragons as random encounters later on. They sort of mixed the sci-fi and the fantasy a little bit more heavily. Phantasy Star 2 went more towards the technology, though. For example, the monsters you fought were bioengineered, man-made monsters. And then you fought robots, and it was only towards the very end that you start to fight more supernatural stuff, like shadows. But even then, they kind of stayed away from traditional mythology. And Phantasy Star 4 kind of follows with that. They make sure to design their living monsters as something really bizarre, even when they're not outright darkness abomination things. And I'm okay with that. It's fine for the Phantasy Star series to have its own unique feel for that sort of thing. I'd also like to mention that this game can play a bit of a nasty navigational trick on you. If you're not paying close attention and notice that the level goes in a loop where you first go down a bunch of stairs and then go up, you can get a little confused about which way you're supposed to be going. And unlike the upper part of the air castle, I cannot afford to get badly lost here. The encounters will just devour me. The occasional dead end is okay, more or less. By the way, these guys are called Blade Right. That's not just some kind of mistranslation thing. It's not an accident. There is such thing as Blade Left, and don't worry, we'll see that later. And you can tell we're getting towards the upper floors again when you see encounters that don't have Chaos Sorcerers in them. As you can imagine, that was a pretty decent amount of relief to me. The sort of limit I set myself for Rune was 100 tech points, so from now on he's using Flail-Eye or Hound. And that, of course, that led me to a little bit of hesitation here, because Blizzard is very nice for these guys. And I am taking a little bit of a risk by pushing Rune's technique points further down. Especially because, of course, the combination attack is not guaranteed to go off. Well, that was a little bit careless of me. Sometimes I kind of play around with the idea of playing games where resurrection is very cumbersome and difficult to come by. I know that almost all role-playing games make it a little bit less finicky as the game goes on, because enemies can gain very dangerous skills. But still, I don't particularly dislike the idea of a game being very punishing along those lines. And once again, this is only a couple episodes after singing the praises of easy games, and I still believe that. But having the option there seems pretty nice to me. Oh boy, missing that plasma shot, that cost me a lot. It's never good to have an encounter where Chaos Sorcerers act twice. And look at that, I'm running low on Medis. That's how bad this is. I cannot, off the top of my head, think of any dungeon that pushes my resources as hard as this one does. And now might be a good time to break out Air Slash. In fact, I should have broken that out earlier when I faced encounters like this. It would have made things go more smoothly. But, you know, I'm still kind of learning. I don't doubt that if I had to play this game through again soon after the playthrough I'm showing off, I would do better. But, as mentioned before, I think that's one of the better properties of games. And why I'm not really opposed to the idea of playing through stuff blind the first time. Although that is absolutely a personal taste sort of thing. I think I would have enjoyed Dark Souls more if I had just looked up all the information resources I could find before playing. Because I have no desire to return to that game. And that doorway means we are close to the end. Double check, even though I was being very careful to keep my my health high. And of course to dual shield Kyra, because that's going to be important. And I like that treasure chest thing. That's a very clever trick to make sure that there's room in your inventory for the key item. One other thing about Lashiec in Phantasy Star 1. He didn't look like that. He was this fairly handsome, charismatic kind of guy. But, of course, being killed by the characters of Phantasy Star 1 has left him a little bit worse for wear. But not less powerful. For one thing, this time you don't have the item that protects you from him. And I hesitate to say that's okay, because the setting is at a bit of a higher power level now. This is the guy that scared me into saving the game before. That's because I've had some bad encounters with him. Grand Cross. Grand Cross is amazing. Even though it's a multi-target combination attack, it's still great because it converts the damage of Crosscut into Holy, which of course Lashiec is weak to. He's also weak to fire and, naturally, Chaz damage. And he will make you suffer if you do not dual shield your spellcasters. When I first played the game, I did not know to dual shield, and thus I suffered, which I think is why I was a little scared to take this guy on today. I kind of didn't realize just how much the dual shield strategy changes this fight. In particular, it means Thunder Halberd does not put your spellcasters in nearly as much danger in one turn. That takes a lot of pressure off of Rika, which is very good because her double slash, once again, it deals Chaz damage, which Lashiec is very, well, reasonably weak to. Nathu is also very strong, and a hang-up I had in early playthroughs was, do I really want to burn so many technique points per turn? I mean, Chaz's technique points are very valuable, and I could get a lot more total attacks off with Githu. But, that's not a good idea against this guy. For some reason, I also thought Rayblade was not very good. I don't know. I didn't know what was what. And I also kind of don't know what's what in this battle, because leaving someone at 100 some odd health is playing with fire. It's dancing with death. And I am shocked, absolutely amazed in hindsight that I did not get punished for it. Of course, as always, the patron saint of the benefit of side dungeons is the Silver Tusk. well, as you can imagine, I have thoroughly changed my mind about the viability of Nathu, or however you want to... I'll say Nathu. Things are... He's wearing me down a little bit, but... For some reason, I had the idea in my head that 100 health was okay. I remember at the time I was a little disappointed that he wasn't doing certain other stuff a lot, but that, honestly, that's not smart. Possession is, of course, a mercy round, but it has a hidden drawback to it. When your character is put to sleep, that character loses all the buffs. And honestly, it would have been a good idea for me to reapply Barrier instead of just throwing out a Flare here, because it's not common for Ren to be in any shape to do something other than recover. This is another thing that will make you suffer if you don't know how it works. So that's a buff, and as described, it raises all of its stats. I do not want to compete with that for turns because its agility goes up, and I definitely don't want it to hit harder, especially because of what, well, you'll see. But there's a solution. As my brother said, the Psycho Wand removes buffs. Doesn't matter what they are. That's a good thing, because it has that. Lashiec can do that. Another gate is terrifying. Just to give you an idea, I saved up all of my Stardews specifically for another gate, because if it spammed that thing, Rika's Gisar is going to run out fast and I'll need resources to fall back on. Stardew is my only solution for that, and I cannot think of any other encounter where it's more necessary. That is, if your luck is bad. But my luck was not bad, so things went just fine. Ooh! Interrupted a villain speech and a MacGuffin snatch. I want to give Rika a lot of credit for defying plot like that. I appreciate that sort of thing. You'll notice that whenever there's a structure created or maintained by something Dark Force related, it falls apart the moment you beat whoever's involved. It happened with Zio's Fort. It happened with the Air Castle. Yeah, that's your clue in case you didn't talk to the guy who said that Dark Force was still around. And now the Air Castle is done. And there's nothing stopping us from going to the Garubik Tower, which is also a fairly lengthy dungeon, but for whatever reason, does not scare me nearly as much as the Air Castle did. Although Lashiec was a singular boss. I admit I haven't talked to too many Phantasy Star 4 players, but my impression is that Lashiec has kind of a special reputation in this game. Well, we'll see that tower next time. Later.